different. Pause it if you need to see it better. Okay. Now let's see if I can remember where I was at. Okay. But let us say you choose to handle your... Nope. Okay. If you are taking sleeping pills only 1 or 2 nights, your cells can usually reestablish their normal balance of functioning without much difficulty. The first night or two without the sedative may be more restless as the cells readjust, but things are then likely to return to normal quite quickly. If you continue to take the pills, however, you will surely become addicted. When the sedatives first appeared on the scene, they immediately force cell A to quiet down. But if their presence continues for more than a day or two, cell A begins to habituate to them. By changing its own physical structures, it becomes less sensitive and responsive to the sedative's effects. Soon you will notice the original amount of sedative no longer works. You have to take more in order to get sleep. In this way, habituation causes tolerance. If you continue to take the increasing amounts that are necessary to get to sleep, you keep overwhelming cell A's habituation. You have effectively stifled its capacity to manufacture and send its neurotransmitter to cell B. Neither cell A's habituation nor cell B's stimulatory feedback has been able to preserve the interior balance. The effects of the sedative have proceeded well into your alertness system, and the whole system must adapt. Cell B adapts by changing its neuroreceptors. When cell A was releasing normal amounts of neurotransmitter, cell B had just the right number and kind of neuroreceptors to receive exactly the amount needed to get its job done. But now the sedatives have caused cell A to release far less neurotransmitter. After its stimulatory feedback fails, cell B builds more receptors, as if hoping to catch as many stray molecules of neurotransmitter as possible. It also increases the sensitivity of these receptors to get the greatest stimulation possible from the few transmitters available. By adapting, cell B establishes a different balance within the system, a new normality. While cell A continues to function at a low level, cell B now has many more receptors that are much more sensitive, and it is therefore able to send along its own messages to other cells with a fairly adequate level of strength and frequency. Things are not back to normal, but the new normality feels good enough until you stop taking the pills. Let's assume that you decide to quit the pills. Your stress is over, and you think you can get back to normal on your own. Or perhaps you run out of pills and cannot get a refill. Either way, the sedatives disappear from your brain. Cell A, now completely accustomed to large amounts of the sedative, quite literally go crazy when it experiences none at all. It rebounds by firing up to an extreme degree, manufacturing and releasing great quantities of the wake-up neurotransmitter. The neurotransmitter molecules come raging in hordes across the synapse, invading cell B's receptors, which, as we have said, are now much greater in number and much more sensitive. The effect on cell B is cataclysmic. I can't say that word either. Cataclysmic. I swear. Okay. Cataclysmic. Its messages to other cells are berserk, unintelligible. All the millions of other neurons that had so dutifully adapted to their to their new normality are now screaming that something is terribly wrong, and you are experiencing both the backlash and the stress that constitute withdrawal symptoms. Lord help me say these words. Your agitation increases dramatically. Stress signals are sent into body control centers deep in the center of your brain. Your heart beats faster and your temperature rises. Your muscles tighten and twitch. Your thoughts race. Countless other systems of cells that have also become accustomed to the presence of the sedative start reacting to the stress. In your frontal and temporal lobes, cell systems that have associated the sedatives with relaxation now start yelling for a fix. It is as if they were shouting, take some more, while the other frontotemporal systems counter with, you shouldn't, you will become addicted. But of course, the addiction has already happened. The battle of the will has begun. Different functional systems that used to be balanced are now contradicting one another, producing mixed motivations. Some of them are trying to stop, and others are fighting desperately to keep the addiction going. All the functional systems that constitute your capacity for self-deception are brought into play. At some point, the I can handle it systems fire up. We know the rest of the story. Chemicals like sedatives can be very addictive because they affect the brain directly. Some substances even have chemical components identical to the body's own natural neurotransmitter chemicals. Such substances are extremely addictive because receptors for their chemicals already exist on cells in the brain. For example, the body creates natural pain-relieving neurotransmitter chemicals called endorphins and enkephalins. Endorphins and enkephalins. Receptor sites for these chemicals occur naturally on many cells in the brain and elsewhere in the body. When a substance like morphine that has the same kind of chemical structure is taken into the body, it joins with these receptors immediately, and its effects are extreme. Similar natural receptors exist for certain stimulants and tranquilizers. Chemicals like morphine and amphetamines, which create sensations of pleasure and relief from pain, along with directly affecting natural neuroreceptors, are the most addictive of all known substances. The next section is called non-substance addictions. I have used chemical substances in this explanation of addiction because their effects are so rapid and powerful. But the same kind of cellular dynamics apply to non-substance addictions. If we had been talking about addiction to money, power, or relationships, even if we had been talking about addiction to images of ourselves or of God, we could have said much of the same about what happens to our nerve cells. We would probably be speaking of different systems of cells, but the patterns of feedback, habituation, and adaptation would be essentially the same. I'm so sorry, y'all. As an example, consider a very minor addiction, one that seems to harbor no special destructiveness. Let us say that I have established a morning routine of having a cup of coffee and reading the paper before starting the day. I enjoy the quiet, undemanding quality of this time and would be loath to call it an addiction. But I have been engaging in this little routine for years, and the cells of my brain have become adapted to it. They are used They are used to the whole sequence of the time, the gentle slowness of waking up, the familiarity of my favorite chair, the gradual stimulation of the reading, the friendly jolt of the coffee's caffeine playing out in its own little addiction fix, the sounds of the house waking up around me. All the countless sensations and behaviors of this time have become mutually associated in patterned sequences of synapses, with billions of cells having become adapted to certain amounts of neurotransmitters in certain ways at certain times. It is normal. Then a couple of days come along in which something interferes with this routine. Perhaps I had to stay up later than usual the night before, so I sleep longer and I have to get up in a hurry, in a rush, drinking my coffee on the way out the door and missing the paper entirely. Although I may not have Okay, hold on, I'm getting ahead of myself. Although I may not even think about it consciously at the time, my body and mind feel as if something is not right. I'm more irritable and grouchy than usual. I may even find myself a little shaky and out of sorts for the rest of the day. It all happens because the cells of my brain have not received what they have learned to accept as normal doses of neurotransmitters in normal sequences and rhythms, and they are reacting with stress. They feel something is wrong. My irritability and shakiness are mild withdrawal symptoms from a minor addiction. Although the withdrawal symptoms in this example are far less severe than those of chemical addiction, vast numbers of cell systems are involved. Apparently, minor addictions often influence so many other systems that they wind up involving more cells than some chemical addictions do. Therefore, a person who becomes temporarily addicted to narcotic painkillers in the hospital may be able to withdraw from the drug more quickly and with much greater serenity than another person can withdraw from the loss of a job or a loved one. The first person's addiction, although chemically intense, involves perhaps only a few million cells directly. It has not had time to influence such larger systems of cells as those having to do with the meaning of life, self-image, and basic security. In the case of losing a job or a loved one, great existential systems are deeply affected by withdrawal, even though the direct impact on any given synapse may be so great. Even though the direct may not be so great. Thus, the brief chemical addiction can be seen as a temporary and primarily physical discomfort, but the non-substance addiction digs deeply into the ground of the person's sense of meaning and selfhood. The next section is called multi-system involvement. In prolonged addictions, what may initially have involved a rather simple change in a few million synapses has progressively expanded to affect billions of cells in countless other functional systems. One after another, each system has tried to defend against the initial imbalance, failed, and adapted by establishing a new normality. In turn, it causes imbalance in the next system, and on the process goes. It is not so difficult to understand how our addictions can come to rule our lives. Each of our major addictions consists not only of the primary attachment itself, it also includes the involvement of multiple other systems that have been affected by it. To put it quite simply, addictions are never single problems. As soon as we try to break a real addiction, we discover that in many respects, It has become a way of life. Because multi-system involvement, breaking an addiction usually requires changes in many different areas of life. A person trying to stop smoking will find the struggle much greater after eating, after sex, or at other times that have become associated with cigarettes. An alcoholic is likely to fall off the wagon if she frequents the same old bar, as is a narcotic addict who continues to associate with the same old friends. A person who is trying to be less attached to money will find it more difficult if he continues his habit of listening to the stock market reports several times a day. The workaholic won't be helped by continuing to spend all her social time with other workaholics, nor will the overeater gain anything but weight by continuing to gaze into the refrigerator whenever he has a spare moment. Similarly, a person who wants to spend more time in prayer and less in doing things is unlikely to gain much if she uses her prayer time to think about the things she should be doing. Multi-system involvement is also responsible for temporary experiences of freedom when a person's environment changes. A compulsive overeater, for example, will struggle in agony with his addiction to food while in his usual environment. But if he goes on a backpacking trip in the mountains, he may feel quite free of the addiction. In the new environment, he is sufficiently removed from other stimuli that have become associated with his addiction, and he can much more easily deal with his primary urge to eat. He may even think that he has finally overcome the problem, only to be deeply disappointed when he returns to his usual surroundings and finds all of his associations triggered afresh. Similarly, a narcotic addict may feel no great desire for drugs when she is hospitalized or in prison, only to re-experience the full power of her addiction upon return to real life. The longer an addiction continues, the more things will become associated with it, and the more entrenched it will become. Some behaviors or chemicals that produce a rapid, direct, and powerful effect may result in addiction after only one or two experiences. Others may require many repeated experiences before they become entrenched. But regardless of how an addiction begins, the longer it lasts, the more powerful it becomes. Attachments are thus like spreading malignancies, steadily invading and incorporating their surroundings into themselves. To apply the words of Isaiah, addictions are like greedy dogs never satisfied. Or as Habakkuk said, forever on the move, with an appetite as large as a shoal and as insatiable as death. Okay. The next section is a stress addiction. It says stress addiction. The phenomenon of becoming attached to stress itself is the phenomenon of becoming attached to stress itself is of particular spiritual significance, and it is a good example of multiple system involvement. Only recently described, stress addiction has received considerable attention in the popular press. Therefore, I will discuss it only briefly in the context of neurology. The body naturally creates adrenaline, noradrenaline, and other chemicals that are important in responding to stressful situations. In addition, some of the body's natural opiates, such as the endorphins and enkephalins, are often released in times of stress. All these stress chemicals act as neurotransmitters. They may be generated by nerve cells and act as message carriers across synapses. or they may be released elsewhere in the body and travel through the bloodstream as hormones. Adrenaline, for example, is manufactured by the adrenal gland and acts as a hormone. Whether stress chemicals come across synapses or not, or through the bloodstream, they exert powerful effects when they arrive at neuroreceptors of nerve cells. Nerve cells. I didn't say the V in there. Normally, the body is accustomed to a low level of stress chemicals in the circulation, with intermittent bursts of higher amounts during times of crisis. Most normal stresses are of relatively short duration, and the brain's natural responses cope with them quickly. In our hectic modern society, however, many individuals find themselves in prolonged stressful situations. Many jobs today are geared to continually high stress levels, and some professionals even pride themselves on the amount of stress they habitually live in. The effects of such protracted stress, have been well demonstrated in terms of heart disease, ulcers, and the like. Jogging and other exercise programs, by stressing the body physically, help accustom the body to coping with high stress levels so it more readily handles them as normal. With all of this, stress becomes a habit. What happens is not difficult to understand. In responding naturally to a stressful situation, the body increases its production of stress chemicals. The chemicals have their expected effects on the cells that receive them, and things return to normal when the stress passes. But if the stress continues, the receiving cells must cope. They try their feedback mechanisms to achieve a lower level of stress chemicals. And if this doesn't work, they habituate and adapt. Their adaptations establish a new normality that includes an excess quantity of stress chemicals. The body suffers in a variety of ways. The circulatory system, for example, must adjust to a normality that includes much more work. Of special significance to our discussion, however, is what happens when the stress addicted person tries to relax and slow down. If the person takes a vacation, goes on a retreat, or even tries to settle down to pray for a while, the removal of external stress causes less stress chemicals to be generated. This is precisely what the person wants and expects, a time of relaxation. But she does not expect the response of her brain cells to this reduction of stress chemicals. The neurons, having adapted to high levels of stress chemicals, now react as if something were wrong. They send signals, ironically, of stress to the rest of the body, trying to get things going again. Thus, the person who is trying to settle down may find herself becoming increasingly anxious, looking around for something to do, and not at all experience the rest and relaxation she had hoped for. Further, the other cells that have become habituated to stress chemicals may go through a backlash withdrawal and crash. They become lethargic in what now seems to them a virtual absence of stimulation. Thus, in addition to agitation, the person may also feel great fatigue and sleepiness. I never knew how tired I really was until I settled down. Again, both phenomena tend to encourage the person not to relax. The choice is limited